Warning: this story contains extreme violence, slasher elements, and murder. I encourage you to listen to the entire story, and if you enjoy this type of content, please subscribe and press the bell icon to stay updated. The old mansion, a constant drumbeat that echoed through its empty halls. Victoria shivered, pulling her coat tighter around her shoulders as she stepped inside. She had just inherited this massive, crumbling estate from an uncle she barely knew, a strange, eccentric man who had spent his final years locked away in this lonely, decaying place. The air inside was thick with dust, the kind of air that seemed to carry memories, whispers of the past, and a distinct chill that settled deep in her bones. She wasn't here by choice. The mansion was a burden, an unwanted inheritance she planned to sell off as soon as possible. But there was something about the place that intrigued her. Something she couldn't quite shake. The rumors surrounding it, the stories of her uncle's madness, the strange and cryptic letter he left behind, all nagged at the edges of her mind. Victoria wandered through the maze of rooms, barely noticing the rotting furniture or the thick layers of grime that coated every surface. Her footsteps echoed eerily, making it feel as though the house were alive, listening, waiting. It wasn't until she reached the sitting room, a grand, forgotten space with high ceilings and a fireplace blackened by years of neglect, that she saw it. The mirror, it was impossible to miss. The mirror dominated the far wall, its ornate frame carved from dark wood that had a strangely sinister quality to it. Like the twisted branches of a dead tree. The glass itself was cracked in several places, but it shone in the dim light with an unsettling clarity. Victoria felt drawn to it, her feet moving toward it of their own accord. She stopped just a few feet away, staring at her reflection. At first, it seemed normal enough. Her reflection stared back, her face pale from the cold, her dark hair wet from the rain. But something was off. The longer she looked, the more it felt like her reflection wasn't too dark, the smile a little too wide. And then, for just a split second, her reflection moved before she did. Victoria stepped back, heart pounding. She blinked, but everything was normal again. Just her, standing in front of an old, broken mirror. Shaking off the strange feeling, she turned and left the room. But as she walked away, she could have sworn she heard something, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper, like the sound of breath on glass. That night, Victoria couldn't sleep. The mansion was too quiet, too still. The rain had stopped, leaving a suffocating silence in its wake. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing with thoughts of the mirror. Of her uncle, of the strange, eerie presence that seemed to linger in every corner of the house. Eventually, she couldn't take it anymore. She got up, throwing on a robe and walking through the darkened halls. She didn't know where she was going, but her feet seemed to know the way. Before she realized it, she was standing in front of the mirror again. It was darker now, the moonlight filtering through the windows casting long shadows across the room. The mirror seemed to pulse in the dim light, its surface shimmering like water. Victoria stepped closer, her breath catching in her throat as she looked into it. Her reflection was there, but it was different. The woman in the mirror looked like her. But her eyes were sunken, hollow, as if she hadn't slept in weeks. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and there were dark veins running up her neck, twisting and curling beneath the surface. But the most horrifying thing was the smile. It was too wide, too sharp, like something out of a nightmare. Victoria stepped back, but her reflection didn't move. It stayed there, staring at her, that twisted smile growing wider and wider until it was a grotesque mockery. Without warning, it lunged forward, slamming its hands against the glass. Victoria screamed, stumbling backward and falling to the floor. The mirror shook violently, the glass cracking even more, but her reflection was gone. Panting, heart racing, she scrambled to her feet and ran from the room, not daring to look back. The days that followed were a blur of terror and confusion. No matter where Victoria went in the house, she could feel the mirror's presence, like it was watching her, waiting for her to return. She tried to stay away, but every night, she found herself drawn back to it, compelled to stare into its depths. and each time she did, the visions grew worse. Her reflection began to change, warping into grotesque, nightmarish versions of herself. She saw herself covered in blood, her hands twisted and deformed, her face a mask of terror and pain. She saw herself screaming, her mouth open in a silent howl, her eyes wide with fear as something dark and monstrous, reached out from behind her. She couldn't escape it. The mirror had her in its grip, and it wasn't letting go. One night, as she stared into the mirror, unable to tear her eyes away, she saw something new. A figure, standing behind her. Tall, shadowy, its face obscured by darkness. It was watching her, just like she was watching herself, and as she turned to look behind her, there was nothing there. But when she looked back at the mirror, the figure was closer. Its face still hidden, but she could feel its eyes on her, burning into her soul. She tried to move, to run, but she couldn't. She was frozen, trapped in the mirror's gaze. The figure reached out, its hand long and skeletal, its fingers curling around her reflection's throat. Victoria gasped, feeling the cold pressure on her own neck, even though there was no one there. She clawed at her throat, trying to breathe, but the grip tightened, squeezing. The figure released her, and she collapsed to the floor, gasping for air. But the terror didn't end there. The next night, the figure returned, closer this time, its features more defined. It wasn't human. Its face was a twisted mass of shadows and sharp angles, its eyes glowing with a malevolent light. It spoke to her, its voice a low, guttural whisper that echoed in her mind. "You belong to me now," it said. Victoria couldn't take it anymore. She had to know the truth. She searched the mansion for answers, digging through her uncle's old papers, looking for any clue that might explain the mirror's power. What she found was worse than she could have ever imagined. Her uncle had bought the mirror years ago from a man who claimed it was cursed. The mirror, the man said, was a portal to another world, a world of nightmares, where the darkest parts of the human soul took form. It didn't just reflect the viewer's fears, it fed on them, growing stronger with each passing day until it could reach out, pulling its victims into the mirror's twisted realm. Victoria realized with growing horror that her uncle hadn't died of natural causes. He had been claimed by the mirror, just as it was trying to claim her. That night, the figure returned, closer than ever, its hand reaching out of the glass, its cold, bony fingers brushing against her skin. Victoria screamed, stumbling back, but there was nowhere to run. The mirror's pull was too strong. She could feel it dragging her closer, pulling her into its dark, twisted world. She fought, clawing at the floor, but it was no use. The last thing she saw before the mirror swallowed her whole was her own reflection, staring back at her with that same, twisted smile. Days passed, and the mansion stood silent once more. But in the sitting room, the mirror still hung on the wall, its surface cracked, and if you looked closely, you could see something, a figure, trapped inside, screaming silently, forever caught in the mirror's grip. The mirror stood in silent triumph, its cold glass now still. The eerie calm in the mansion was suffocating. Victoria was gone, lost to the mirror's dark realm, but her suffering had only just begun. Inside the mirror's twisted world, time didn't exist as it did in the real world. Seconds felt like hours. Days stretched into eternity. Victoria's eyes snapped open, her body trembling. She was no longer in the mansion. Around her was a hellish landscape, an endless, darkened void where the air felt thick and oppressive. Shapes moved in the shadows, distorted and grotesque, like the echoes of nightmares. There were faint screams in the distance, blood-curdling and endless. Her heart raced as she stood. Realizing her body felt wrong, heavier, as if the mirror had stolen something from her, she stumbled forward, disoriented, and saw them, reflections. Dozens, maybe hundreds of twisted versions of herself stared back from every angle. Some were mutilated, others covered in blood. All wore the same deranged smile, mocking her with their grotesque forms. They moved even when she stood still, shifting unnaturally as if watching her every move. Her breath quickened, eyes darting around in panic. She had to escape, but there was nowhere to go. The sky above her bled into the ground, and the ground beneath her seemed to writhe, alive with a dark, pulsing energy. This was the mirror's world. And it was hungry. Suddenly, a voice called out, deep and resonant. "You should not have come here." Victoria turned sharply. A figure was emerging from the shadows, towering and misshapen. Its skin was a sickly gray, its face hidden beneath a hood of rotted fabric. The thing's hands were long and skeletal, its nails sharpened into claws that dragged against the blackened ground with a sound that sent a shiver up Victoria's spine. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The figure didn't answer immediately. Instead, it circled her slowly, the air growing. He spoke, its voice was a rasping whisper that seemed to come from every direction at once. "I am the keeper of this place. And you. You are one of many who has fallen under the mirror's curse." Victoria's mind raced. The keeper? What was this place? She tried to move, but the ground beneath her feet seemed to grip her ankles, pulling her down into the darkness. She struggled, but the more she fought, the deeper the blackened earth dragged her. "No," she screamed, her voice breaking as her knees sank into the ground. The keeper's head tilted, as though amused. "The mirror feasts on fear. It shows you the worst parts of yourself, devours your mind, and then consumes your soul. You will never leave." Victoria's body trembled violently as the hands of the ground tightened around her, pulling her deeper. Desperate, she clawed at the air, her fingers bleeding as she tried to free herself. But it was no use. The mirror's world was alive, feeding on her terror, her despair. Suddenly, the hands released her, and she collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath. Her relief was short-lived, however, as she realized the keeper was now standing directly in front of her. Its face was no longer hidden. Instead, it was a grotesque reflection of her own, twisted and deformed, its eyes blackened and hollow. "You are nothing here," it hissed. "Just another soul for the mirror to consume." Without warning, the keeper lunged at her, its clawed hand wrapping around her throat. Victoria gasped, choking as it lifted her off the ground, her feet dangling helplessly. She struggled, kicking and thrashing, but the keeper's grip was like iron. Slowly, painfully, it dragged her toward a large, jagged shard of glass jutting from the ground, a piece of the mirror's broken world. Victoria's reflection appeared in the shard, twisted and horrific, her eyes wide with terror. The keeper pressed her closer, for stared, the more the reflection changed. Her skin began to rot, her hair fell out in clumps, and her body withered into a skeletal form. It was as though the mirror was showing her the future, what she would become if she stayed here. "No." Victoria screamed, her voice barely a whisper as the keeper's grip tightened, but it was too late. The shard of glass began to glow, pulsing with an eerie light, and Victoria could feel it pulling her in, dragging her soul toward it. The reflection smiled, its decayed mouth twisting into a cruel, mocking grin, and then, with a sickening lurch, Victoria was pulled through the glass. On the other side, everything was wrong. The world was no longer just darkness. It was a twisted, nightmarish version of the mansion, her uncle's estate, but warped beyond recognition. The walls were covered in bloodstains, the floors slick with a foul, black substance that clung to her feet. Everywhere she looked, there were mirrors. Some were small, cracked and dirty, while others were enormous, taking up entire walls, and in every mirror, her reflection waited, watching. The mirrors began to pulse, like living things, their surfaces rippling as though they were made of liquid. Her reflection started to change again, their faces contorting into grotesque parodies of her own, their mouths filled with jagged, rotting teeth. They were no longer just reflections. They were something else. Something alive. Suddenly, one of the reflections stepped out of its mirror. Victoria stumbled back, horror flooding her veins. The thing was identical to her, but twisted beyond recognition, its skin peeling away to reveal muscle and bone. It let out a low, guttural growl, its eyes burning with an unnatural hunger. Before she could react, more of them began to emerge from the mirrors. Dozens of them, each one more horrific than the last. They moved toward her with jerky, enclosing like the snapping jaws of a beast. Victoria turned and ran, her heart pounding in her chest. She sprinted through the endless halls of the warped mansion, her feet slipping on the black, oozing substance that coated the floors. Behind her, she could hear the reflections chasing her, their distorted voices echoing through the halls. "You can't escape," they whispered. "You belong to us." She turned a corner and slammed into a door, her hands fumbling with the handle. She threw it open and stumbled inside, slamming it shut behind her. Her breathing was ragged, her body shaking with fear. But as she turned around, her blood ran cold. The room was full of mirrors. They covered every wall, every surface, reflecting her in an infinite number of twisted, nightmarish versions. And in the center of the room stood the mirror, the original mirror, the one that had started it all. Its surface was smooth, unbroken, and it gleamed with an unnatural light. But there was something wrong with it. It was pulsating, like it was alive. And as Victoria stared into it, she saw something move behind the glass. It was the figure from before, the keeper, but now it was fully formed. Its eyes glowed with a malevolent light, its mouth twisted into a cruel grin. And it was coming for her. Victoria backed away, her mind racing. She had to destroy the mirror. It was the only way. But how? There was nothing in the room she could use, no weapon, no tool. She was trapped, surrounded by the mirror's twisted power. The keeper stepped closer, its hand reaching out of the glass, its fingers long and sharp. Victoria's heart pounded in her chest as she scrambled backward, her eyes darting around the room. And then she saw it, a small, jagged piece of broken glass lying on the floor. Without thinking, she grabbed it, the sharp edges cutting into her palm. Blood dripped onto the floor as she turned to almost fully out of the glass now, its twisted form towering over her. With a scream of defiance, Victoria lunged forward, slamming the shard of glass into the mirror's surface. There was a blinding flash of light, and the mirror shattered, its pieces exploding outward in a shower of glass and blood. The keeper let out a horrific scream, its body disintegrating into black smoke as the mirror's power was destroyed. The reflections in the room shattered as well, their twisted forms crumbling into dust. Victoria collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath. The mansion around her began to shift, the walls returning to their normal, dilapidated state. The mirrors were gone. And the black ooze that had covered the floors disappeared. She was free, or so she thought. As Victoria stood, her body aching from the ordeal, she caught a glimpse of something in the corner of her eye. A reflection. But there were no mirrors left. Slowly, she turned, her heart pounding in her chest. There, in the shattered remains of the mirror, her reflection was still standing. It smiled at her, that same twisted, deranged smile she had seen before, and then, without warning, it stepped out of the glass. Victoria's scream echoed through the empty halls of the mansion, but there was no one left. It echoed through the crumbling mansion, but the sound was swallowed by the oppressive silence that had settled over the place like a heavy shroud. Her reflection stood before her, no longer a twisted mockery but an exact copy, as if it had been peeled from her very soul and given flesh. Its eyes were wide, pupils dilated with hunger, lips curled into a smile that promised nothing but agony. For a moment, neither of them moved. Victoria's breath came in ragged gasps, her eyes scanning her doppelganger. It was identical to her in every way but one: it wasn't afraid. It stood taller, more confident, as if it had long since accepted the horrors that Victoria was still desperately trying to flee. "What are you?" Victoria's voice trembled, cracking under the weight of her fear. The reflection cocked its head, that eerie smile never fading. When it spoke, its voice was her own, but colder, sharper, each word dripping with malice. "I'm you, but stronger. I'm the truth. Everything you've tried to bury, everything you fear. I am your darkest self." Victoria took a step back, her body instinctively recoiling. Her mind screamed at her to run, but where could she go? The mansion had become a maze of horrors, and her only company was this twisted version of herself. The reflection stepped forward, mirroring her movements with sickening precision. "You can't hide from me. I am in every shadow. Every corner of your mind. You'll never be free of me. Victoria's stomach churned, bile rising in her throat. She had to do something, anything to stop it from getting closer. Her eyes darted around the room, looking for a weapon, a way out, but the reflection's voice cut through her thoughts like a knife. Do you know why the mirror chose you? It whispered, its eyes narrowing as it took another step forward. Because you've always been weak. You've lived your life hiding from the truth, pretending you're strong when deep down all the others. Her heart pounded in her chest, blood roaring in her ears. The reflection was so close now she could see every detail, every pore, every strand of hair. It was perfect. Too perfect. Suddenly, the reflection's hand shot out, grabbing her wrist with an iron grip. Victoria gasped, the coldness of its touch seeping into her bones. She tried to pull away, but it was useless. The reflection's strength was inhuman. Let go. She screamed, panic surging through her as she struggled against the doppelganger's hold. The reflection only smiled wider, its eyes gleaming with sadistic delight. You don't understand, do you? There's no letting go. You are part of me now. Just as I am part of you. We're bound, forever. In one fluid motion, the reflection yanked her forward, slamming her into the nearest wall with brutal force. Victoria's vision blurred as pain shot through her body. Her head hit the wall with a sickening thud, and for a moment, she thought she might lose consciousness. But the reflection wasn't done with her. Look at me, it hissed, grabbing her chin and forcing her to meet its gaze. Look at what you really are. Victoria's eyes flickered open, her vision swimming. Her reflection's face was inches from hers, and in its eyes, she saw something that made her blood run cold. It wasn't just a reflection. It was something far worse, something ancient. Something that had been waiting for her, feeding off her fear, her insecurities, her pain. The mirror hadn't just shown her darkest self. It had created it. I can't. She whispered, her voice weak, trembling. This isn't real. Oh, but it is, the reflection purred. And now, we're going to have some fun. Before she could react, the reflection's hand shot down to her throat, squeezing with unnatural strength. Victoria gasped for air, her hands clawing at her doppelganger's arm, but it was like trying to tear through stone. Her lungs burned as she thrashed around her. Stop. She choked, her vision going black at the edges. Please. The reflection leaned in closer, its breath hot against her ear. Why would I stop? This is what you deserve. With a sudden burst of strength, the reflection hurled her across the room. Victoria's body crashed into the floor, the impact knocking the wind out of her. She lay there, gasping, struggling to catch her breath. Pain radiated through every part of her body, but she knew she couldn't stop. Not now. Not with that thing still coming for her. Slowly, painfully, she pushed herself up onto her hands and knees, her body trembling. She could hear the reflection's footsteps behind her. Slow and deliberate as it closed in. I'll give you a choice, the reflection said, its voice taunting, dripping with cruelty. You can fight me. But you'll lose. Or you can accept it. Become what you truly are. Victoria spat blood onto the floor, her eyes burning with rage. Go to hell. The reflection chuckled darkly. We're already there. With a snarl, Victoria scrambled to her feet, grabbing a broken shard of glass from the floor. Her hand shook as she clutched the sharp edge, blood trickling from her palm. The reflection stopped, eyeing her curiously, as if amused by her defiance. You really think that'll work? It asked, its voice mocking. Victoria didn't answer. She charged forward, slashing wildly at the reflection. The glass caught the light, gleaming as it cut through the air, but the reflection was faster. It sidestepped her attack with ease, grabbing her wrist and twisting it sharply. The shard of glass slipped from her fingers, clattering to the floor. You never learn, the reflection whispered, tightening its grip on her wrist until she cried out in pain. In one swift motion, the reflection slammed her against the wall again, pinning her there with inhuman strength. Victoria struggled, but it was useless. She was enjoy this, the reflection said, its voice low, almost sensual. Watching you break. Watching you become me. Victoria's breath hitched, her eyes wide with terror. She could feel it now, the pull of the mirror, the darkness creeping into her mind, her soul. It was overwhelming, suffocating, like drowning in a sea of shadows, but then, something snapped inside her. No, she whispered, her voice shaking but filled with a newfound determination. I won't let you win. The reflection's smile faltered, its grip on her wrist loosening ever so slightly. Victoria seized the opportunity, slamming her head forward into the reflection's face. Pain exploded in her skull, but the reflection stumbled back. Momentarily stunned, this was her chance. Victoria lunged for the shard of glass on the floor, her fingers closing around it just as the reflection recovered. With a primal scream, she drove the shard into the reflection's chest. It let out a guttural howl, its body convulsing as the glass pierced its flesh. For a moment, Victoria thought she had won, but then the reflection laughed. It was a horrible sound, twisted and wrong, as though the reflection was reveling in the pain. Slowly, it looked down at the shard of glass protruding from its chest, then back up at Victoria, its eyes gleaming with malice. Nice try, it said, pulling the shard out of its body with a sickening squelch. But you can't kill me. I am you. Victoria's heart sank as the reflection tossed the shard aside, completely unharmed. It stepped toward her, its eyes dark with rage. But I can kill you. The next moments were a chaos. Victoria fought with every ounce of strength she had left, but the reflection was relentless, its attacks brutal and merciless. Blood splattered the walls as the two of them clashed, their bodies slamming into the furniture, breaking anything. Victoria was losing. She knew it. Her body was battered, her vision blurred from the blood running down her face. But she couldn't give up. She wouldn't. In a last-ditch effort, she threw herself at the reflection, tackling it to the ground. They rolled across the floor, grappling with each other, but the reflection was too strong. It pinned her down, its hands wrapping around her throat once more. Victoria gasped, choking as the reflection squeezed, its eyes blazing with fury. This is the end, it growled. You're mine. But just as the world began to fade, just as the darkness threatened to swallow her whole, Victoria's hand brushed against something cold and smooth on the floor. A mirror shard. With the last of her strength, she grabbed it and drove it into the reflection's neck. The reflection let out a blood-curdling scream, its grip on her throat loosening. Victoria scrambled to her feet, gasping for air, as the reflection writhed on the floor, black smoke pouring from its wound. For a brief moment, she thought it was over. She thought she had won, but then the reflection's body began to change. Its skin peeled away, revealing something far more horrific underneath. Its bones cracked and twisted, its form elongating into something monstrous. It was no longer just a reflection. It was the very embodiment of the mirror's curse.